"Don't touch it," someone whispered from the darkness. "Anything left to die in this forest is meant to be forgotten." The wind carried that warning across the frozen clearing, thin and sharp like the edge of winter itself. But Elena Whitmore didn't move away. She stood there at the tree line, boots half sunk in crusted snow, breath trembling in the cold air as her eyes fixed on the shape lying ahead, barely visible beneath a dusting of pale frost. The outline unmistakable even from a distance, a wolf, large, unnaturally still, its side rising so faintly it could have been mistaken for the shifting of wind across snow. And for a moment she hesitated, not out of fear, but because she knew exactly what the others would say if they saw her now, that she was foolish, that she was weak, that she never learned her place. And yet her feet carried her forward anyway, step by careful step across the uneven ground, the forest around her silent in that heavy, watchful way that came before something changed. Her worn coat brushing against frozen branches, her fingers curling tighter at her sides as if bracing against something deeper than the cold, because she had heard those same words her entire life. Not worth saving, not worth choosing, not worth anything at all. And now here it was again, laid out before her in another form. Something discarded, something no one had claimed, something everyone had already decided should be left behind. She reached the edge of the clearing and stopped just a few feet away, her breath catching as she finally saw it clearly. The wolf's fur was dark beneath. The frost, thick and matted in places where snow had settled unevenly. Its body larger than any she had ever seen up close, even among the strongest hunters of the pack. But what struck her most wasn't its size. It was the stillness, the quiet kind that didn't belong to rest, but to something closer to surrender. And her chest tightened at the sight, a familiar ache rising, the kind she had learned to hide long ago, because it mirrored something inside her she could never quite name, something broken but not gone, something overlooked but still breathing. "It won't last the night." A voice echoed in her memory, cold and dismissive, the same tone they used when they spoke about her, when they thought she couldn't hear, when they assumed she wouldn't matter either way. And Elena swallowed hard, her throat dry despite the biting air, because she could walk away right now. No one would know, no one would care. It would be easier, safer, expected. But her body refused to turn, her knees bending slowly as she lowered herself into the snow beside the wolf, the cold seeping through the fabric of her clothes instantly, sharp and grounding, her hand hovering just above its side, trembling not from fear but from the weight of the choice itself, because once she touched it, there would be no pretending she hadn't chosen this, no denying what it meant. The wolf's breath was faint, uneven, barely there, but it was there. And that was enough. That had always been enough for her, a small, stubborn sign that something could still be saved, even when the world had already decided otherwise. And she exhaled softly, the sound almost lost to the wind as her fingers finally lowered, brushing against the coarse fur, colder than she expected, but real, undeniably real. And in that instant, something shifted, not in the forest, not in the air, but inside her chest, a quiet, steady resolve that replaced the hesitation entirely, her palm pressing more firmly now as she leaned closer, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You're not alone," she said, not knowing if the wolf could hear her, or if she was saying it for herself, or if it mattered at all, because in that moment, with the snow falling lightly around them and the world holding its breath, Elena Whitmore made a choice no one else would have made. And she didn't yet realize that the thing she had just reached for was never meant to be left behind at all. The cold did not fade after she touched him. It deepened, settling into her fingertips as though the winter itself had chosen to linger there. And Elena Whitmore drew in a slow breath, steadying herself as she shifted closer, her knees pressing into the snow while the faint rise and fall beneath her palm became the only thing anchoring her in that moment. Because it was fragile, so fragile, she almost feared that even the weight of her hand might be too much, and yet she did not pull away. Instead, she leaned in, her other hand moving cautiously to brush away the thin layer of frost gathered along the wolf's shoulder, revealing darker fur beneath, damp and tangled, the texture rough against her skin, and she swallowed against the quiet tension building in her chest, a familiar feeling she had never quite learned to ignore, the pull toward something that needed her even when she knew the cost of stepping forward. Because in her world, kindness was not rewarded. It was questioned, dismissed, sometimes even punished, and still she could not stop. The forest remained silent around her. No distant calls, no shifting branches, just the faint whisper of wind threading through bare limbs, as though the entire place had withdrawn to watch what she would do next. And Elena lowered her head slightly, her breath warming the space between them as she closed her eyes for just a second, centering herself the way she always did when she tried to help, not with strength, not with force, but with something quieter, something she had never been able to explain, only feel, like a soft current moving beneath the surface of her thoughts, waiting for her to let it flow. Her fingers pressed more firmly into the wolf's side now, not enough to cause discomfort, just enough to hold contact, to ground that invisible connection she was reaching for, and she exhaled slowly, letting the tension slip from her shoulders as she focused entirely on the faint rhythm beneath her hand, matching it, steadying it, guiding it the way she had done countless times before with smaller wounds, smaller hurts, things no one else noticed or cared to mend. But this was different. This was deeper, heavier, and for a brief moment doubt flickered through her, sharp and unwelcome, reminding her of every time she had been told she was not enough, that what she carried was insignificant, that it would never matter in a world ruled by power and dominance. And her jaw tightened as she pushed that voice aside, because right now none of that mattered, not here, not with this life resting so uncertainly beneath her hands. A faint warmth began to build, barely noticeable at first, like the first hint of sunlight after a long night, spreading slowly from her chest down her arms, into her palms, and Elena inhaled sharply at the sensation, her eyes opening as she looked down, not in fear, but in quiet recognition, because she knew this feeling, had always known it, even when others dismissed it as nothing more than imagination, even when they told her it was weak, useless, something to hide rather than trust. But here, in the stillness of the forest, it felt undeniable, real in a way that no one could take from her, and she let it grow, did not fight it, did not question it, simply allowed it to move through her, steady and warm against the cold that surrounded them. The wolf's breathing shifted beneath her touch, subtle but present, a fraction stronger than before, and Elena's lips parted as she let out a quiet breath she had not realized she had been holding, her shoulders easing just slightly as hope flickered, small but persistent, the kind that refused to be extinguished even after years of being told it should not exist. And she leaned closer, her voice soft, almost lost to the wind. "Stay with me," she murmured, the words simple, unadorned, but filled with a sincerity that ran deeper than anything she had ever spoken aloud. Because she was not asking for anything in return, not expecting recognition or reward. She was simply choosing, again, to care, even when the world had shown her again and again that it did not care for her. Her hand shifted gently, brushing along the wolf's side in slow, deliberate movements, as if reminding it that it was still here, still present, still worth holding on to. And for a moment, everything else faded, the pack, the voices, the rules that had defined her life, leaving only this quiet connection in the middle of a frozen clearing, where an Omega no one valued knelt beside a life no one had claimed, and refused to let it slip away unnoticed. The warmth did not fade. It deepened, spreading through Elena's hands in a slow, steady pulse that felt almost alive, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe that it was working, that something inside her, something she had spent years hiding, might actually be enough to hold on to a life that the world had already abandoned. But that fragile hope barely had time to settle before the forest shifted, not loudly, not violently, just a subtle change in the air, a pressure that made her shoulders tense and her breath catch as she lifted her head slightly, listening, because she knew that feeling, the quiet warning that she was no longer alone. The crunch of snow followed, deliberate and unhurried, and Elena's hand instinctively stilled against the wolf as her gaze flickered toward the edge of the clearing, where shadows began to separate into shapes, figures stepping between the trees with the confidence of those who never questioned their right to be anywhere they pleased. And her chest tightened as recognition settled in, members of her pack, drawn either by curiosity or by the simple instinct to control what they did. not understand. And she swallowed, forcing her breathing to remain even as her pulse quickened, because she already knew how this would go, how it always went. "Of course it is you," one of them said, his voice carrying easily through the still air, edged with that familiar blend of amusement and disdain, and Elena did not need to look directly to know who it was. The tone alone was enough. The kind that reduced everything she was into something small, something laughable, something unworthy of attention unless it served as entertainment. And she lowered her gaze again, not in submission, but in focus, her fingers pressing slightly more firmly into the wolf's side, as if anchoring herself to the only thing that mattered in that moment. "You found something to play healer with," another voice added, softer but no less cutting, and there was a shift of movement as they came closer, boots pressing into the snow, surrounding the clearing with an ease that made her feel suddenly very exposed, very aware of the fact that she was kneeling, vulnerable, positioned between them and the creature they had already decided did not deserve to live, and her jaw tightened as she felt that familiar pressure build, the expectation that she would step aside, that she would yield, that she would remember her place and make this easier for everyone involved. Elena's hand trembled once, just once, before steadying again, her shoulders straightening despite the cold seeping deeper into her bones, because she had lived this moment in 100 different ways before, had been pushed aside, spoken over, dismissed without a second thought. But something about this felt different, something about the faint, steady breath beneath her palm refused to let her retreat, and she drew in a slow breath, her voice quiet but clear as she spoke without looking up. "He is still alive." The words simple, undeniable, and for a second there was silence, the kind that came not from agreement but from surprise, as if they had not expected her to speak at all. A low chuckle broke it, dismissive, and Elena could almost see the expression that accompanied it, the slight tilt of the head, the narrowing of eyes that marked her as naive, as foolish for caring about something that did not benefit anyone. "That will not last," the first voice replied, closer now, and she felt the shift of presence just behind her, the weight of someone standing too near, too confident that she would move if they simply waited long enough, and her fingers curled slightly into the wolf's fur, not enough to cause harm, just enough to ground herself again, as that quiet warmth within her flared a little stronger, pushing back against the creeping cold of doubt. She could feel their attention on her, waiting, measuring, expecting her to fold under the pressure the way she always had before, and for a brief moment fear flickered, sharp and insistent, reminding her of consequences, of how easily they could take control of the situation, how quickly they could dismiss her entirely. But then the wolf's breath shifted again beneath her hand, just a fraction, just enough to remind her why she was still here, and that was all it took. Elena lifted her head slowly, her gaze moving forward rather than back, her posture straightening even as she remained kneeling, and though her voice remained soft, there was something different in it now, something steady, something that did not bend as easily as it once had. "Then it deserves a chance," she said, each word measured, deliberate, and the clearing seemed to hold that sentence for a moment, the weight of it settling between them, simple but unyielding, because for the first time, Elena Whitmore was not asking for permission, she was choosing, and she was not stepping aside. No one moved at first, and that was what unsettled Elena the most. Not the presence behind her, not the cold pressing deeper into her skin, but the silence that followed her words, because it was not agreement, it was calculation, the kind that came just before someone decided how much resistance they were willing to tolerate, and she felt it shift around her like a tightening circle, subtle but unmistakable, the air growing heavier, as if even the forest understood that something had changed. "A chance," the first voice repeated, slower this time, as though testing the words for weakness, and Elena kept her gaze forward, her hand steady against the wolf's side even as her pulse quickened, because she knew that tone, had heard it countless times when they humored her just long enough to remind her that she had no real say in anything, that whatever she chose could be undone with a single step forward, a single command. And yet she did not lower her head this time, did not retreat into silence the way she once would have, because the faint, steady warmth in her palms had grown stronger, more certain, and it grounded her in a way nothing else ever had. "You are wasting time," another voice said, sharper now, less amused, and there was movement to her left, a figure stepping closer into her peripheral vision, boots pressing into the snow with quiet authority, and Elena felt the instinctive urge to shift back, to make space, to avoid conflict, but she held her position, her fingers curling slightly into the thick fur beneath them, not in fear, but in resolve, because if she moved now, even an inch, she knew she would not stop. She would be pushed aside the rest of the way, and the fragile life beneath her hand would be dismissed without another thought. It is not part of our pack. The voice continued, measured and cold, as if that alone was enough justification, and Elena's jaw tightened as those words settled in, because she had heard that reasoning before as well, applied not just to creatures in the forest, but to people, to anyone who did not fit neatly into the structure they valued, anyone who could be overlooked without consequence. And for a brief moment anger flickered beneath her ribs, quiet but sharp, not directed outward, but inward, at the realization of how easily she had accepted that logic in the past, how often she had stepped aside because she believed she had no right to stand her ground. The wolf's breathing shifted again, a little stronger now, and Elena felt it clearly this time. The subtle expansion beneath her palm, the faint warmth returning where there had only been cold before, and her breath caught softly as something in her chest eased, not completely, but enough to steady her, enough to remind her that this was not meaningless, that what she was doing mattered in a way they could not see, or refuse to see, and she leaned slightly forward, shielding the wolf's body more fully with her own, her posture still low but no longer uncertain. Move. The first voice said at last, no longer testing, no longer amused, and the single word settled into the space between them like a line drawn in the snow, clear and unmistakable. And Elena closed her eyes for just a second, feeling the weight of it, the expectation, the inevitability that had defined every similar moment in her life. And then she exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing not in surrender, but in decision, because she understood now that nothing would change if she continued to yield, if she continued to believe that her place was always behind someone else's will. When she opened her eyes again, her gaze remained forward, her voice quiet but steady as she spoke. No. The word soft, almost lost to the wind, but it carried, clear, enough that the silence that followed it felt different, heavier, edged with something closer to disbelief than dismissal, and she could feel their attention sharpen, the shift from casual control to something more focused, more aware, as if they were seeing her for the first time not as background, but as an obstacle. Elena did not turn to face them, did not challenge them with her eyes. She simply remained where she was, her hand warm against the wolf's side, her body a barrier they would have to acknowledge, and though her heart beat faster, though the cold pressed harder against her skin, she did not move, because for the first time, standing her ground did not feel like defiance for the sake of it. It felt like truth, simple and unyielding, and in the quiet that followed, the forest seemed to hold its breath again, waiting to see who would break first. The word lingered in the air long after she spoke it, soft but immovable, and for a moment nothing followed, no immediate response, no sharp retort, just that heavy, suspended silence that pressed in from all sides, as if the forest itself had leaned closer to listen, and Elena could feel it, the shift in attention, the way their presence behind her changed from casual disregard to something more focused, more deliberate, and it sent a quiet ripple through her chest, not fear exactly, but awareness, because she understood what came next would not be so easily dismissed. You are serious, the first voice said at last, lower now, stripped of its earlier amusement, and Elena did not turn, did not look back, because she knew if she met their eyes she might falter, might see the weight of their authority reflected there, and she could not afford that. Not now, not when the warmth beneath her hands had grown steadier, more insistent, as if responding to her resolve. She drew in a slow breath, the cold air sharp against her lungs, and nodded once. A small movement, but deliberate, and her fingers pressed slightly more firmly into the wolf's side, grounding herself in that steady rhythm that had strengthened just enough to remind her why she was still here. It is dying, another voice said, less certain this time, as though trying to reclaim control through logic, through inevitability. And Elena's lips parted slightly as she listened, because she could hear it too, faint unevenness in each breath, the fragility of it. But she also felt something else now, something they could not. The subtle thread of warmth weaving through the cold, holding on, refusing to fade. And she shook her head gently, her voice quiet but unwavering as she answered, "Not yet." And the simplicity of it seemed to unsettle them more than defiance ever could. There was a shift behind her, a step closer, then another, the snow compressing under measured weight. And Elena felt the proximity like a pressure against her back, a silent expectation that she would move, that she would make this easier, that she would remember who she was and who they were. But instead she leaned forward slightly, her body curving protectively around the wolf, her shoulders tightening not in fear but in instinct, because the line had already been drawn, and stepping back now would undo everything she had chosen. The wind picked up just enough to stir the edges of her coat, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and frost, and Elena closed her eyes for a brief moment, centering herself again, focusing on the warmth that now pulsed steadily through her hands, stronger than before, more certain, as if something within her had finally decided to stop hiding, to stop shrinking under the weight of expectation, and she let it flow, did not question it, did not hold it back, because this was the only thing she had ever known how to give, and for once, it felt like enough. The wolf's breathing deepened beneath her touch, still fragile but undeniably stronger than it had been moments ago, and Elena felt it clearly, the shift from fading to holding on, and her chest tightened with something dangerously close to relief, her fingers brushing lightly along its side as if reassuring it, or herself, that it was still there, still fighting, still worth this stand. Behind her, the silence stretched again, but it was different now, no longer dismissive, no longer certain, and she could feel their hesitation, subtle but present, the way their confidence wavered just enough to create space, and she held on to that, not as victory, but as proof that something had changed, that her choice had weighed after all. "You will regret this," the first voice said finally, not loud, not threatening, just matter of fact, as if stating something inevitable, and Elena inhaled slowly, letting the words settle without taking root, because she had lived with regret before, had carried it quietly in the spaces where she had chosen silence over action, and she knew which one stayed with her longer. She opened her eyes again, her gaze fixed forward, her posture steady despite the cold, and though her voice remained soft, there was no hesitation in it. Now, no trace of the uncertainty that once defined her. "Maybe," she said, and the word hung there for a second before she added, just as quietly, "but not for this." And that was all. No explanation, no justification, just truth, simple and unyielding. And as the wind settled once more around them, Elena Whitmore remained exactly where she was, her hands warm, her resolve steady, and for the first time, she did not feel small. The silence did not break the way Elena expected it to. There was no sudden movement, no immediate force that pushed her aside. Instead, there was something far more unsettling, the absence of it. The way the presence behind her seemed to hesitate, as if something unseen had shifted the balance just enough to make them pause, and she felt it, not through sight, but through the subtle change in the air, the pressure easing just slightly, the certainty behind her no longer as absolute as it had been moments before. She did not turn to confirm it. She did not need to, because her focus remained fixed on the faint, steady rise beneath her hands. And for the first time since she had stepped into the clearing, the rhythm felt different, less fragile, more anchored, as though something deep within the wolf had begun to respond not just to her touch, but to her refusal to let go. Elena inhaled slowly, her breath steadying as the warmth in her palms grew stronger, spreading further up her arms, no longer a faint flicker but something more defined, something that felt like it belonged to her in a way she had never fully allowed before. And she leaned closer without realizing it, her shoulders curving protectively, her presence becoming a quiet shield rather than a hesitant one. The forest remained still, but not empty. There was a weight to the silence now, something watchful, something that made the hairs at the back of her neck rise even as she stayed grounded, because it did not feel like danger, not exactly. It felt like attention, focused and sharp, as though something far beyond the few figures behind her had taken notice of this moment. of her choice, of the life she refused to abandon. The wolf's breath deepened again, subtle but unmistakable, and Elena's eyes softened as she felt it, her fingers brushing lightly through the thick fur, clearing away what little frost remained. And beneath it the warmth had returned more fully, no longer distant, no longer slipping away, and her chest tightened with a quiet, almost unfamiliar sense of relief, because she had not been wrong. Not this time, not about this. Something is different. One of the voices behind her said, low and uncertain, and Elena stilled for a fraction of a second, not from fear, but from the realization that they could feel it too, not the warmth itself, but the shift, the undeniable change in what they had assumed was already decided, and she let out a slow breath, her posture remaining steady as she kept her attention forward, unwilling to give them anything more than what she had already shown. Step back, another voice said, but it lacked the sharp edge it had carried before, as if even the command was being reconsidered, and Elena did not move, her hands still anchored, her presence unwavering, because she understood now that this was not just about defiance. It was about trust, trust in something she had been taught to ignore, something that had never been given space to prove itself until now. The wind shifted again, softer this time, brushing through the clearing with a gentler touch, carrying away the tension that had pressed so heavily before. And Elena felt it in the way her shoulders eased just slightly, the tightness in her chest loosening as the moment stretched, no longer poised on the edge of confrontation, but something else, something quieter, something that felt like the turning of a page she had never been allowed to read before. Beneath her hand, the wolf stirred, not fully, not enough to break the stillness, but enough to be felt, a faint shift of muscle, a subtle response that sent a quiet shock through her system, and her breath caught as she leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. That is it, she murmured, not commanding, not forcing, just encouraging, the way she always had, the way that had always been dismissed as weak, and yet here it was, working in a way nothing else could. Behind her, no one spoke, and that silence was no longer dismissive. It was watching, waiting, and Elena realized then that whatever happened next would not belong to them. It would not be decided by rank or expectation or the rules she had lived under her entire life. It would belong to this moment, to this connection, to the choice she had made when she refused to walk away. And as the warmth in her hands deepened once more, steady and certain, she held on, not just to the wolf beneath her touch, but to the quiet, undeniable truth that for the first time, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The shift was subtle at first, so slight that Elena almost thought she imagined it. A change not in movement, but in presence, like the difference between a still lake and one just beginning to ripple beneath the surface. And her breath slowed as her fingers stilled against the wolf's side, her entire focus narrowing to that single point of contact where warmth now pulsed steadily beneath her palms, no longer fragile, no longer fading, but gathering, strengthening, as if something deep within. The creature had begun to awaken in response to something deeper within her. The air in the clearing grew heavier, not with threat, but with expectation, and Elena felt it settle over her shoulders, pressing down in a way that made her acutely aware of every breath she took, every small movement she made. And yet she did not pull back, did not hesitate, because whatever this was, it did not feel like something she needed to fear. It felt like something she needed to witness, beneath her hands. The wolf's body shifted again, more clearly this time, a faint tightening of muscle, a subtle reclaiming of strength that had been absent only moments before, and Elena's eyes widened slightly as she leaned closer, her breath catching in quiet disbelief, because this was more than survival now. This was response. This was something answering her, meeting her halfway in a way she had never experienced before, and her voice dropped to a soft murmur, barely audible. "You are still here," she said, the words simple, but filled with a quiet certainty that steadied her even as everything around her seemed to hold its breath. Behind her, the others had gone completely silent, not the dismissive quiet she was used to, but something else, something watchful, uncertain, and she could feel their attention sharpen, the way their presence no longer pressed forward but lingered, as if they too sensed that this moment had shifted beyond their control, beyond their understanding, and for once, they did not interrupt. The wind softened, the sharp edge of cold easing just enough to allow a different sensation to settle in, a faint warmth that did not come from the air, but from the connection beneath her hands, spreading outward in slow, steady waves. And Elena felt it in her chest, in the way her breathing aligned with the rhythm beneath her palms, as if she and the creature were no longer separate in this moment, but part of the same fragile, strengthening thread. Then the wolf's head moved. Not much, just a slight tilt, a subtle adjustment that would have gone unnoticed by anyone not paying close attention, but Elena felt it instantly, her breath catching as her fingers stilled completely, her entire body going quiet in response, because this was different, this was undeniable, and slowly, carefully, she lifted her gaze just enough to see it more clearly. Its eyes opened, not fully, not sharply, but enough to reveal a glint beneath heavy lids, a faint, pale reflection that caught the dim light of the clearing. And Elena froze, her heart pounding softly against her ribs as that gaze met hers, not with confusion, not with fear, but with something else entirely, something aware, something far too steady for a creature that had been moments from fading away, and it sent a quiet shiver through her, not of fear, but of recognition she could not explain. Time seemed to stretch in that moment, the forest fading into the background as everything narrowed to that single connection, those eyes holding hers with an intensity that felt far deeper than instinct, far more deliberate than survival. And Elena found herself unable to look away, her breath shallow, her thoughts quieting as something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need words to be understood. Then, as suddenly as it had opened, the wolf's gaze shifted, its eyes closing again as its body settled. But the presence did not fade. It remained, stronger now, anchored, and Elena let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding, her hands still warm, still steady, her heart still racing with the quiet certainty that whatever lay before her was not what it seemed. And behind her, no one spoke, because for the first time, none of them knew what to say. The moment did not release her. Even after the wolf's eyes closed again, it held her there, suspended between what she had just seen and what she could not yet understand. And Elena remained perfectly still, her hands resting where they were, the warmth beneath her palms no longer a question but a steady, undeniable presence that pulsed in quiet rhythm with her own breath, as if something deeper than instinct had taken root between them. The forest seemed to lean inward, the silence no longer empty but charged, filled with something that made the air feel heavier, more deliberate, and Elena became aware of it in the way her senses sharpened, every faint sound, every shift of wind, every subtle movement behind her registering with a clarity she had never experienced before, as though the world itself had narrowed to this single point in time. She swallowed slowly, her throat dry despite the cold, and her gaze lowered once more to the wolf, studying the rise and fall of its chest, the steadiness that had replaced the fragile, fading rhythm from before, and a quiet realization settled over her, not sudden, not overwhelming, but certain. This was no longer a life slipping away. This was something holding on, something gathering strength in a way that defied everything she had been told to expect. Behind her, the tension shifted again, no longer pressing forward, but pulling back, uncertain, and she could feel it in the space they left, the slight retreat of presence that spoke louder than any words could have, because these were not wolves who hesitated, not wolves who stepped back without reason, and yet they did now. And Elena understood that whatever had just happened had unsettled them in a way they could not easily dismiss. "Did you see that?" one of them said quietly, the question not directed at her, but into the space between them, and it carried a note she had never heard from them before, uncertainty, and Elena's fingers curled slightly into the wolf's fur, not in tension, but in grounding, because she had seen it, she had felt it, and she knew without needing to turn that they had as well. The wind moved through the clearing again, softer now, carrying with it a faint shift in scent. Something unfamiliar layered beneath the cold air, subtle but present, and Elena's breath caught as she recognized it not through memory, but through instinct, something deeper, something that made the warmth in her chest flare just slightly in response, as though whatever lay beneath her hands was no longer simply recovering, but revealing something that had been hidden beneath weakness and silence. The wolf stirred again, more clearly this time, its body adjusting against the snow with a controlled, deliberate motion that sent a quiet jolt through Elena's system, and she leaned forward instinctively, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It is all right," she murmured, not because she believed it needed reassurance, but because she did, because this moment had moved beyond anything she could explain, and yet she refused to pull away from it. Her hand shifted gently along its side, feeling the strength that had returned, the warmth that now radiated beneath the surface, and her chest tightened with something that was no longer just relief. It was awe, quiet and steady, because she understood now that she had not simply helped something survive, she had touched something far greater than she had ever been allowed to imagine. Behind her, no one interrupted, no one stepped forward, and that silence spoke louder than any command ever had, because for the first time, they were not in control of what unfolded here, and they knew it. Elena remained where she was, her posture steady, her presence unwavering, and as the wolf's breathing deepened once more, stronger now, more certain, she felt it clearly. The shift from fragile existence to something far more powerful, something waking, something returning. And though she did not yet understand what it meant, she knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever she had chosen to save in this quiet, frozen clearing was no ordinary life, and whatever came next would change everything. It was not the movement that changed everything. It was the stillness that followed it, the kind of stillness that felt deliberate, controlled, as if the world itself had paused not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, and Elena felt it settle deep in her chest, a quiet pressure that made her breath slow without her telling it to, her senses sharpening in a way that made every detail around her feel more defined, more real, as though something unseen had stepped into the clearing and claimed it without a single sound. Her hands remained where they were, but she became aware of the difference beneath them immediately. The warmth no longer just returning, but stabilizing, deep and steady, like something that had never truly been gone, only waiting, and her fingers stilled against the wolf's side as she felt it, the strength gathering, the quiet certainty replacing the fragile edge of survival. And her heart began to beat faster, not from fear, but from the weight of understanding that was beginning to form. The air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, and Elena noticed how the cold no longer pressed against her skin in the same way, as if something within the clearing had changed the balance itself, softening the bite of winter just enough to make space for something else, something warmer, something alive, and she swallowed slowly, her gaze lowering to the wolf as it moved again, not weakly, not uncertainly, but with intention, its body adjusting beneath her hands in a controlled, measured way that sent a quiet shock through her system. Because this was not recovery anymore. This was presence. Behind her, no one spoke, and that silence felt different now, no longer uncertain, but cautious, as if even they understood that whatever was unfolding had stepped beyond their control, and Elena could feel it in the way their presence held back, not retreating entirely, but no longer pressing forward, as though an invisible line had been drawn that none of them were willing to cross. She leaned forward slightly, her breath steady but shallow as her hand shifted just enough to follow the movement beneath it, her voice barely a whisper. "You are stronger," she said, not as a question, but as a realization, and the words seemed to settle into the space between them, carried on the quiet air as though they belonged there. The wolf's head lifted, slowly this time, not a faint tilt, not a fleeting motion, but a deliberate rise that brought it fully into awareness, and Elena froze, her breath catching in her throat as she watched it, her entire body stilling in response, because there was nothing uncertain about this now, nothing fragile left in the way it held itself, and when its eyes opened again, fully this time, there was no haze, no weakness, only clarity, sharp and unwavering, and something within her shifted in response, a quiet, instinctive recognition she could not explain. Those eyes met hers again, but this time there was no question in them. No searching, only awareness, deep and steady, and Elena felt it like a physical presence, the weight of that gaze settling over her, not heavy, not threatening, but undeniable, and her breath slowed even further as she found herself unable to look away, her thoughts quieting under the intensity of that connection, because it felt as though she was being seen in a way she never had before, not as something lesser, not as something to be dismissed, but as something that mattered. The world around them seemed to fade. The forest, the cold, the figures behind her, all of it receding into the background as that moment stretched, held between them in a way that felt both fragile and unbreakable. And Elena's fingers remained still against the wolf's side, not because she was unsure, but because she understood now that whatever had begun here was no longer hers to guide. It had become something else entirely. Behind her, a breath was drawn sharply, the first sound in what felt like an eternity, and it broke the stillness just enough to remind her that they were not alone. But it did not break the moment, did not weaken it, because whatever stood before her now was no longer something they could dismiss, no longer something they could control, and Elena knew it, not through thought, but through the quiet certainty that settled deep in her chest, steady and unshakable, as the creature before her rose fully into itself, and the truth began to surface in a way that could not be undone. The moment held for one breath longer, and then everything changed without a single sound, because the shift did not begin with movement, it began with presence, the kind that filled the space so completely that Elena felt it before she saw it. A quiet force rising from the wolf beneath her hands, steady and undeniable, like something ancient waking after a long, deliberate silence. Her fingers remained where they were, but the sensation beneath them transformed, no longer fur alone, no longer the familiar structure she had been holding on to, but something deeper, something reshaping in a way she could not explain, and her breath caught as warmth surged through her palms, stronger than anything she had felt before, spreading up her arms and into her chest with a quiet intensity that made her heart pound softly against her ribs. The air around them thickened, not with fear, but with power, subtle yet overwhelming, and Elena's gaze lifted slowly as the form before her began to change. Not abruptly, not violently, but with a smooth, controlled transition that felt almost natural, as if this had always been waiting beneath the surface, hidden only by circumstance. The wolf's body shifted, its shape adjusting with deliberate precision, and Elena found herself pulling her hands back slightly, not out of rejection, but because she understood instinctively that this moment was no longer hers to guide, that whatever was unfolding now existed beyond her touch, beyond her influence. And she watched, her breath shallow, her entire body still as the transformation continued, quiet and absolute. Where there had been fur, there was now something else. Where there had been a creature fighting to hold on to life, there stood a presence that carried its own gravity. And Elena's eyes widened as the truth settled over her in slow, undeniable waves, not all at once, but piece by piece, until it became impossible to ignore. The figure before her straightened, rising fully, and with that movement the entire clearing seemed to shift in response, the air tightening, the silence deepening, and behind her she felt it, the sudden, instinctive reaction of those who had moments ago stood so confidently, their presence changing instantly, sharply, as if something within them had recognized what she was only beginning to understand. Elena did not turn, she did not need to, because she could feel it in the way the forest itself seemed to bow, in the way the quiet around them was no longer passive, but reverent, and her gaze lifted further, meeting the figure before her fully for the first time. He stood there, steady and composed, his presence filling the clearing without effort, and though there was no movement of threat, no raised voice, no command spoken, everything about him carried a quiet authority that made the air feel different, heavier, as if even the ground beneath them acknowledged him. Elena's breath slowed, her thoughts momentarily scattered as her mind struggled to align what she had seen with what stood before her now. And for a second she remained frozen, caught between disbelief and recognition, because she knew, somewhere deeper than logic, deeper than anything she had been taught, that this was not simply a man, not simply a stranger, but something far greater, something that held weight in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. His gaze found hers again, the same steady intensity she had seen before, but clearer now, sharper, and Elena felt it settle over her, not as pressure, not as judgment, but as awareness, as if he saw her completely in that moment, every choice she had made, every reason she had stayed, and her breath caught softly as something inside her responded, quiet but undeniable. Behind her, the first sound broke through the silence. Not a word, but the subtle shift of movement, a step back, then another, and Elena understood without looking that they had recognized him, that whatever uncertainty had held them before had been replaced by something else. Entirely, something closer to respect, to instinctive acknowledgement of power they would never challenge. She remained where she was, still kneeling in the snow, her hands now resting loosely at her sides, the warmth within her slowly settling. And though everything around her had changed, though the truth had revealed itself in a way she could never have predicted, one thing remained steady, her gaze, her presence, and the quiet certainty that she had made the right choice, even before she knew who he truly was. And as the silence deepened once more, no longer uncertain, but absolute, Elena Whitmore found herself facing the man who had once been the dying wolf beneath her hands. And in that moment, the world she knew shifted into something entirely new. No one spoke his name, but Elena felt it in the way the world responded to him, in the way the silence deepened not from emptiness but from recognition. And as she slowly rose from her knees, her movements careful, measured, she became aware of just how much had shifted in a matter of seconds. The cold no longer biting the same way, the air no longer pressing in with quiet judgment, but holding steady, as if waiting, as if watching what would happen next. Her eyes remained on him, unable to look away, not because she was afraid, but because something about his presence demanded it, not forcefully, not through intimidation, but through something far more subtle, something that drew her attention without effort, and she felt it settle into her chest, a quiet awareness that this was no ordinary encounter, that the moment she had stepped into this clearing had led her here for a reason she had not yet fully understood. He did not move immediately, did not speak, and yet everything about him was active, aware, his posture steady, his gaze unwavering as it remained fixed on her. And Elena felt it again, that same sensation from before, that she was being seen in a way she had never experienced, not judged, not dismissed, but acknowledged, and it sent a quiet ripple through her, something unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Behind her, there was movement, subtle but unmistakable, the shifting of weight, the quiet adjustment of stance, and she did not need to turn to know what it meant. They had stepped back, not just physically, but in presence, in authority, and the realization settled over her slowly, almost unreal, because these were the same people who had moments ago spoken over her, dismissed her, expected her to yield without question, and now they remained silent, their confidence replaced with something closer to caution, to respect they could not deny. Elena's breath steadied as she stood fully now, her hands falling to her sides, the warmth that had once surged through her palms now settling into a quiet, steady hum beneath her skin, no longer overwhelming, but present, as if it had become part of her in a way she could not separate. And she found herself holding on to that, not out of fear, but out of grounding, because everything else around her felt unfamiliar, changed, reshaped by what had just occurred. His gaze did not waver, and after a moment, he took a single step forward, not rushed, not forceful, but deliberate, and the effect was immediate, the air shifting with him, the space adjusting as though it recognized his movement as something significant, and Elena felt it in the way her breath caught softly, not from fear, but from the weight of that presence drawing closer, closing the distance between them in a way that felt both inevitable and entirely new. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough that she could see the details now, the steadiness in his expression, the clarity in his eyes, and there was something there that held her attention, something that felt both distant and deeply focused all at once. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, but full, as though words were unnecessary to convey what had already passed between them. Then, finally, his voice broke the stillness, low and even, carrying easily through the quiet air. "You stayed," he said, and though the words were simple, they held weight, recognition, not of what had happened, but of the choice behind it, and Elena felt it settle into her chest. That acknowledgement, quiet but undeniable, because it was not praise, it was not surprise, it was understanding. Her lips parted slightly, her breath steady as she met his gaze without looking away. And for the first time in her life, she did not feel the need to lower her eyes, did not feel the instinct to make herself smaller, because something in his presence allowed her to remain exactly as she was, and she answered simply, "I could not leave," her voice soft but certain, and the truth of it hung between them without hesitation. A faint shift passed through his expression, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough that she noticed, a subtle acknowledgement that went beyond her words, as though he understood not just what she had done, but why. And the silence returned once more, but it felt different now, no longer uncertain, no longer waiting, but settled, as if something had been decided without needing to be spoken aloud. And in that quiet, Elena Whitmore stood before him, no longer unseen, no longer overlooked, but fully, undeniably recognized. The quiet did not break after her words. It deepened, settling into the space between them with a weight that felt final, as if something unseen had reached its conclusion and now simply waited to be acknowledged. And Elena stood there, steady, her breath slow, her gaze unwavering as she held his, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning whether she belonged in this moment, because something inside her had already answered that long before he spoke. He studied her in silence, not with impatience, not with doubt, but with a level of attention that made everything else fade into the background. And Elena felt it clearly, the way his focus did not waver, the way it settled on her as though nothing else in the clearing held equal importance, and it sent a quiet, steady warmth through her chest, different from before, not the energy she had used to heal, but something else entirely, something that felt like recognition taking form. Behind her, the others remained still, their presence subdued now, their earlier confidence replaced by something that held them back without needing to be spoken. And Elena could feel it in the way the space behind her had opened, the way no one stepped closer, no one interrupted, as though whatever authority they once held here had been quietly set aside without question. He took another step forward, closing the remaining distance between them until only a few feet remained, and the shift in the air was immediate, not overwhelming, but undeniable, the kind of presence that did not demand attention yet commanded it all the same. And Elena felt her breath catch softly, not from fear, but from the simple weight of standing so close to something she now understood was far beyond ordinary. His gaze lowered briefly, not in dismissal, but in observation, as if taking in every detail, her posture, her expression, the faint traces of cold still clinging to her coat, the quiet steadiness in the way she stood. And when his eyes lifted again to meet hers, there was something more there now, something that had not been present before, something deeper than acknowledgement, something that felt like a decision. "No one touched me," he said quietly, his voice even, carrying no anger, no bitterness, only truth, and the words settled into the air with a weight that reached further than their meaning alone, because Elena understood immediately that he was not speaking only of this moment, not only of what had just happened, but of something larger, something that had existed long before she stepped into the clearing. And her chest tightened slightly as she held his gaze, because she had not thought of it that way, had not considered what it meant. For someone like him to be left alone, unseen in that form, untouched not out of respect, but out of fear or indifference. Her voice remained soft as she answered, but there was no hesitation in it, no second guessing. "You were not meant to be left there," she said, and the words came naturally, not as a statement of defiance, but as something simpler, something she believed without needing to explain. And for a moment the silence returned, but it felt different now, no longer waiting, no longer uncertain, but full, as if something essential had been placed exactly where it belonged. His expression shifted again, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough that she noticed, and then, slowly, he reached out, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with the same deliberate control that had defined every movement he had made so far, his hand lifting just enough to close the space between them. And Elena felt her breath pause, her body stilling as his fingers gently, almost carefully, touched her wrist. The contact was brief, light, but it carried a quiet intensity that sent a soft, steady warmth through her arm, echoing the sensation she had felt before. Only this time it was not something she gave. It was something she received, something that settled into her without resistance. And her eyes widened slightly as she looked at him, because she understood then that this was not coincidence, not chance. This was connection, something deeper than either of them had spoken aloud. "And yet you did," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less steady, and the words held a weight that reached beyond gratitude, beyond acknowledgement, something that felt closer to certainty, and Elena felt it settle into her chest, grounding her in a way she had never experienced before, as if this moment had placed her exactly where she was meant to stand. Behind her, the silence remained absolute, the forest itself still, and in that quiet, Elena Whitmore stood before him not as someone overlooked, not as someone dismissed, but as someone who had been chosen by nothing more than her own decision to stay, and for the first time, she understood that choice had changed everything. The warmth from his touch did not fade when his hand lowered. It lingered, steady and quiet beneath Elena's skin, as if something unseen had settled there with intention, and she stood unmoving, her breath slow, her mind no longer racing but still, grounded in a way she had never known before, because nothing about this moment felt uncertain anymore. Not the man before her, not the choice she had made, not the way the world itself seemed to have shifted around them. The forest remained silent, but it was no longer the empty quiet she had grown used to. It was something fuller, something aware, as though every branch, every shadow, every breath of wind had aligned itself with what had just occurred, and Elena felt it in the way the air held steady, in the way the cold no longer pressed against her, but existed around her, separate, distant, as if she stood at the center of something that could not be disturbed. Behind her, there was movement again, subtle but unmistakable, not forward, not challenging, but retreating, a step back, then another, and Elena did not need to turn to understand it. She felt it in the way their presence faded, the way the tension that had once filled the clearing dissolved, completely, replaced by something quieter, something closer to acknowledgement, and for the first time, they did not try to speak over her, did not try to claim authority over what they did not understand. They simply stepped away. She remained where she was, her gaze still on him, and for a moment neither of them spoke, but the silence between them was no longer heavy, no longer waiting to be broken. It was settled, as if everything that needed to be said had already passed between them without words, and Elena felt it clearly, the quiet certainty that this moment was not the end of something, but the beginning. His eyes held hers, steady and unwavering, and there was something in that gaze now that had not been there before, something deeper than recognition, deeper than acknowledgement, something that felt like decision, and Elena felt her breath slow even further as she met it without hesitation, because she understood now that whatever came next would not erase what had already happened. It would build from it, shape it into something neither of them had planned, but both of them had already accepted in ways they could not deny. The wind moved gently through the clearing, carrying with it the faintest shift of warmth, and Elena felt it brush against her skin, light and steady, as if marking the moment in a way that would not fade, and she closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to hold on to it, to anchor herself in the truth of what she had just experienced, because she knew, without question, that nothing would return to the way it had been before. When she opened her eyes again, he was still there, unchanged in presence, unwavering in the quiet authority he carried, and yet something about him felt closer now, not in distance, but in connection, as if the space between them had been altered in a way that could not be undone, and Elena felt it settle into her chest, steady and unshakable, a quiet understanding that she was no longer standing at the edge of something she did not belong to. She was part of it now, fully, undeniably. He stepped forward once more, closing the final distance between them, and this time there was no pause, no hesitation, his presence, enveloping the space around her with quiet certainty. And when he spoke, his voice carried not just through the air, but through the stillness itself, grounding the moment in something final, something unyielding. "From this moment," he said, his tone calm, steady, leaving no room for doubt, "you are under my protection." And the words settled into the clearing like something ancient, something binding, not spoken loudly, not forced, but absolute in their meaning. And Elena felt them take hold, not as a command, but as a promise, Her breath caught softly, not from fear, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of what those words meant, because she understood now that this was not just acknowledgement, not just recognition. It was a declaration that reached far beyond this moment, far beyond the clearing, into a future she had never allowed herself to imagine. And yet here it was, placed before her without condition, without hesitation. Behind her, no one moved, no one spoke, and the silence that followed was complete, not empty, but full of something that could not be challenged. And Elena Whitmore stood there, steady and unafraid, as the world around her settled into its new shape, knowing with absolute clarity that the moment she chose to stay had not only saved a life, it had changed her own forever.